The title appeared like lightning in the middle of a bright sky. Conspiracy or fact? Jungkook moves away and Jimin becomes the figure behind him, a sentence that immediately splits two worlds of fans. On the one hand, some believe this is just an ordinary dynamic in the long journey of a global idol. But on the other hand, there is anxiety that cannot be denied. Something feels different, something feels unusual. It all started from a small change that was almost invisible. Jungkook, a figure who has been known to be full of energy, spontaneous, and always present with a smile that seems to never end, suddenly shows a more closed side. On several occasions, he was seen avoiding the camera spotlight, reducing interactions that were usually so warm, and even in moments that used to be filled with jokes, now it feels quieter. For some people, this may just be a phase. But for Army, who is used to reading his every move, this is a signal. The question then arises, what really happened? Jimin's name is slowly being dragged into this vortex of speculation. Not without a reason. Many began to notice how the dynamics between the two seemed to change. There are moments where Jimin looks more dominant in certain situations, as if he is a balancer, or maybe a director. In several clips that circulated widely on social media, Jungkook was seen turning his head towards Jimin several times before taking action. A small gesture that was then interpreted massively by netizens. Is this evidence of influence? Or is it just a form of trust between two friends who have been through so many things together? Behind the glitter of the stage and the world spotlight, the relationship between BTS members has always been a sensitive topic. They are not just co-workers, but a family formed from the same pressure, dreams, and struggles. Jungkook, who has entered this world since a very young age, grew up with the members, including Jimin, who is known to have a strong emotional and caring side. But it is precisely the closeness that is now being speculated. Some say that Jimin is trying to protect Jungkook from excessive pressure, especially after the increasing global expectations towards him as one of the most influential idols today. There are also those who argue the opposite, that the influence may be too great, to the point of unknowingly limiting Jungkook's freedom to express himself. This narrative is further reinforced by the change in Jungkook's communication style in front of the public. He becomes more careful, more selective in speaking, and sometimes seems to hold back something that is not revealed. In the entertainment world, changes like this are often interpreted as the result of internal or external pressure. And this is where speculation develops into a theory that does not necessarily have a basis, but is strong enough to shake public perception. However, it is important to see this from a broader perspective. The South Korean entertainment industry is known for its very high standards, intense pressure, and almost inhuman expectations. An idol is not only required to look perfect, but also to maintain their image, emotions, and even their relationships in front of the public. In conditions like this, behavior change can be a form of adaptation, not conflict. Jimin himself is known as an empathetic figure. He is often seen giving emotional support to other members, including Jungkook. In various interviews, he once expressed how much he wanted to always be there for the people he cared about. If it's true that he has influence on Jungkook, it could be from the intention to protect, not control. But the public rarely sees the intention. What is seen is only the result. And when the result looks different from usual, questions arise. Did Jungkook really stay away? Or is he just finding a new version of himself in the midst of growing pressure? And is Jimin really the figure behind the change? Or is it just a place to lean on for someone who is struggling in silence? The truth may never be fully revealed, because behind every smile on stage, there is a story that is not always shared. Behind every decision, there are considerations that are not always understood by the public. And behind every relationship, there is a dynamic that cannot be simplified into black and white. What is clear, both Jungkook and Jimin are human, with their own emotions, pressures, and journeys. They are not characters in the story that can be easily labeled as protagonists or antagonists. They are individuals who grow, change, and adapt in a world that continues to demand more. Maybe this is not about a conspiracy or a fact. Maybe it's about how we as spectators try to understand something that we've never fully seen. And in the midst of all that speculation, one thing remains certain. The bond between them is not built overnight and will not collapse just because of an assumption. But that question will still hang, like an echo that never really goes away. Is what we see only the surface, or is it a clue of something deeper? The answer, perhaps, only they know. And that's where everything becomes more complicated. Because the more people try to understand, the deeper the gap of speculation is created. The narrative about Jungkook's stay away no longer stands alone. It begins to branch out into various versions of stories that collide with each other. Some call this as a phase of maturity, some call it emotional exhaustion, and not a few begin to associate it with more complex internal dynamics. Some old fans are starting to recall how Jungkook once expressed the pressure he felt since he was young. He grew not only as an individual but as a symbol. Every step is noticed, every expression is analyzed, and every small change becomes the subject of global discussion. In such conditions, staying away may not be an option, but a necessity. A way to breathe in the middle of a world that continues to demand it to always be present. But then Jimin's shadow reappeared in the public conversation. Not as an antagonist, but as a figure who is always near those points of change. In several recordings that went viral again, it can be seen how Jimin is often by Jungkook's side in quieter moments. Not on a stage full of spotlight, but behind the scenes on the sidelines of fatigue, between a pause that is rarely seen. This is where the point of view begins to shift. What if all of this is not about who is behind whom, but about who stays when everyone starts to move away? Because if you look deeper, the relationship between Jungkook and Jimin always has a layer that is not simple. They are not just two members in one big group, but two individuals who have watched each other grow from the earliest point to the top of the world. There is silence that only they understand. There is language without words that does not need to be explained to the public. But the public, as usual, is never satisfied with the silence. They fill that empty space with assumptions. They string small pieces into a big story. And in that process, often the boundary between reality and interpretation becomes blurred. One look can be considered as a signal. One step back can be considered as a conflict. And one consistent presence can be considered as a control.in fact. Not all closeness means influence. Not all changes mean problems. There is a possibility that is rarely talked about, that Jungkook is in the reflection phase. That he, for the first time in a long time, tried to understand himself beyond the world's expectations. And in that process, he chose to be quieter, more selective, more keeping his distance. Not because he is moving away from others, but because he is getting closer to himself. And if it's true that Jimin is there, maybe his role is not as a director but as a guard. Someone who doesn't push, doesn't pull, but just makes sure that Jungkook doesn't fall too deep while trying to stand on his own way. But again, this is just a possibility, because in a world built by camera spotlight, the truth is often hidden outside the frame. What is not recorded can actually be the most important part of the story. And what is seen does not necessarily reflect the whole. Speculation may continue. There will always be new theories, new video clips, and new interpretations that try to answer the same question. But maybe the question itself needs to be changed, and no longer, is this a conspiracy or a fact? Instead, why do we want to find something behind someone's change? Because sometimes change doesn't need a big reason. Sometimes it just happens slowly, quietly, without announcement. And perhaps the most difficult to accept is the fact that not everything has to be explained. In the midst of all this, one thing to remember is that Jungkook and Jimin, like other humans, have the right to change without having to give an explanation to the world. They have the right to have space, to have limits, and to go on their journey without always having to be understood. But for those who have followed this journey from the beginning, that curiosity will always be there. A desire to make sure that everything is okay. A hope that behind all those changes there are no hidden wounds. And maybe that's the real point of all this, not about conspiracy, not about theory, but about care that sometimes turns into speculation. This story is not over yet. Maybe it will never really be finished, because as long as they are still walking on the same path, as long as the public will continue to try to read the direction of their steps. And among all the voices that try to guess, perhaps the most important is one simple question that never loses its meaning. Are they okay? A question that, ironically, does not require a long answer, but instead becomes the most difficult to answer.